I'm Iris Ruth Pastor, and we're here today for a little small talk with David Kushner, who is a Tampa native, a teacher of graduate journalism at NYU, and an author. David has written the book Levittown, Two Families, One Tycoon, and a Fight for Civil Rights in America's Legendary Suburb. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
It's great to have you with us, and I know that you'll be coming to Tampa soon in honor of the Jewish Book Festival. How do you feel about coming back to Tampa and to Congregation Road of Shalom, where you were bar mitzvahed?
Hopefully I won't feel as much pressure as I did when I was 13, but it'll be very nice to come back and to share this story with everybody in Tampa, to see some old faces and really to bring this story down there. When I wrote this book, I didn't realize the extent to which there are Levittowners all over the country, and especially down in Florida. I think there's a lot of people who kind of pass through Levittown at some point, or somehow that city touched their lives. So I'm sure there'll be people there who had some personal connection to Levittown as well.
Why did you decide to write the story of the Levitt Brothers and also the Wexlers, who were the Jewish family who secretly arranged for a black family to move next door to them in one of the subdivisions?
Right. It was a couple things. I mean, really the main thing that made me want to write the story was that I felt like it was a story just that hadn't been told before. And that's always what I'm looking for as a writer, is just an opportunity to tell a compelling untold story. And Levittown, I grew up in Tampa. I grew up in the suburbs there. Levittown was iconic to me, just like it is to, I think, a lot of people, because it represented, the kind of the cookie cutter great American suburb, and I found that interesting. But then, as I started to learn this story, and I learned that there was a dark side to that story. There was this whites only policy. Then there was this whole fight against this by these two families who really took on this Tycoon and William Levitt. Then I saw that there were all the pieces there, I thought, for a good story that I could tell.
You kind of give us a thumbnail sketch of the days and the weeks that led up to and followed this whole incident, so we have a little bit more of a guideline as to what the national view of this kind of thing was at the time.
Right. Levittown was, like I said, sort of considered the great American suburb, the post-war suburb. And the brothers, had built this in the 40s in Long Island. And it was important because there were all these veterans coming back from World War II who had nowhere to live, and they couldn't afford homes. And the Levitts were really, entrepreneurial and really savvy with regard to marketing. And they put together this new kind of a community, which was low cost, so people could afford to get in there. And it used some of the principles of mass production that Ford had pioneered to create this new kind of community. I mean, they were building as many as 60 homes in a day that you could buy for $7,900. So they were the heroes. They were the heroes for these returning veterans. But at the same time, there was this dark side, and they actually had this whites-only policy where they were turning away African Americans who wanted to come live there and who had every right to live there, especially because the veterans who were moving into Levittown were doing so on the GI Bill. And here were these African American veterans they had the same opportunities to get these low cost houses, and they were being turned away. So that was really the setup for the conflict that ultimately happened in the story that I told, which was in summer 1957, when a Jewish family from the Bronx had moved into a Levittown community, and then, as you said, secretly arranged for a black family to buy the house next door, and that sparked this summer-long race riot in Levittown. What I think is unique about the Levittown story is that this was happening at a period of time, and it was in the North. This was 1957. And there were more than one Levittown community. Both of them were in the North. One was right outside of New York City. The other one's right outside of Philadelphia. So at the time, I think a lot of people were looking to the South and saying, well, this is a Southern issue. This is a Southern problem. When in fact, this was going on right there. And for me as a writer, that was kind of interesting as I was researching because I kept wondering why wasn't this more widely reported or why isn't there a greater record of it? And what I found out was that there's a terrific book called The Race Beat, which won a Pulitzer Prize, and it's about how the press covered the civil rights era. And what that was talking about was how, the media really didn't. This was still relatively early on in the civil rights struggle. So it was after Rosa Parks, it was after Brown versus Board of Education, but it was still early, and the press was really looking, especially the press in the North, were reluctant to cover these kinds of stories that were happening in the North. They would rather focus their attention on the South. And, this story that I tell at one point coincides with the story in Little Rock, where, which happened in October in 1957. So that sort of overshadowed this at the time.
Well, the other thing that I found very curious, and maybe I read this wrong in your book, but the Levitt brothers were Jewish, and they built a very upscale subdivision which did not allow Jews. Is that correct?
Yeah, they were Jewish, and it's another I guess a kind of a subtext of this story, which is how it's really looking at the roles of two very different Jewish families in the civil rights era. On the one hand, you had the Wexlers, who were fighting to integrate, more or less, and then you had the Levitts, who were practicing these policies of exclusion, which, as you mentioned, it actually started with Jews. So they built on the North Shore of Long Island was some of their first communities before Levittown. So these were big. They were homes aimed at a more affluent population. But the practice in that community was to not let Jews in. So Bill Levitt, who later became hugely philanthropic and a huge supporter of Israel, he always was able to compartmentalize being a businessman and being, and the social issues that were around him. So he just did what he felt the other businessmen were doing, which was to not let Jews into this community. And so that's true. I mean, that is how it started out. And he was, this is a guy who was the grandson of a rabbi.
But that's a good answer. I mean, he compartmentalized it. Business was business.
Yeah.
I have another question to ask you. What most surprised you after the book was published by people's reactions? Were there any surprises?
That's a good question. A few things. I mean, I think one is that a lot of people, even in Levittown, didn't know this was going on at the time. And, Levittown's a big sprawling community, but because of the lack of coverage in the local press, they didn't know. The local newspaper had a couple stories that got further and further back into the back of the paper because they didn't really want to bring light to it. So that was surprising. And I guess also what's kind of sadly surprising is the extent to which there's been almost, cover-up might be too strong of a word, but that really has been an active effort to sweep this under the rug. I mean, I was down doing the research. I went to the Levittown Historical Society in Long Island, and the woman there, basically rolled her eyes when I brought this up and said, that, well, Levitt just did what he had to do, which, certainly wasn't true. And, and they have school kids coming through Levittown today who are getting this story fed to them about, making it sound as though he was just, didn't have control over this policy that was happening, which is completely false. So it was sadly surprising, like I said, to see that this is still being perpetuated today.
Thank you very much. David Kushner, author of Levittown, will be entertaining Tampa's audiences during the Jewish Book Festival on Wednesday, November 10th at 7 p.m. at, of course, Congregation Road of Shalom. I'm Iris Ruth Pastor, a contributor to Let My People Know, an outreach and engagement initiative.